I wouldn't be here if not for this woman. As the head of Delilah Communications in the 1970s, she engaged me to write my very first book, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, which led to my second book, The Authorized Biography of the Bee Gees. And she's here today to talk about her book on Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Bad. And at some point, which she'll tell us a little bit about before we get to the book, Stephanie Bennett, as the force of Delilah Communications, transferred into Delilah Films. And if this wasn't the first, this was certainly the first giant hit that the company had, the Complete Beatles. It was really the first time there had been any sort of Beatles documentary that you could see and buy and take home and live with great moments in Beatles history. And that's it's part of the Beatles course if you took that. Made a film about the Everly Brothers, and then earlier in the quarter, you remember we had Paul Justman here, who was here to talk about his Motown film, Standing in the Shadows of Motown, but he was also involved in the Chuck Berry film, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, editing the concert sequences with the director Taylor Hackford. And if we're talking about a course called Docs That Rock, Docs That Matter, and the Chuck Berry film is one of the greatest and most important music documentaries of all time, there kind of is no rock and roll without people like Chuck Berry. Unfortunately, there isn't a film like this about Little Richard, but fortunately there is one about Chuck Berry. And the reason there is the woman I'd like to bring on stage, Stephanie Bennett. So just to go back in time a little bit,
Yeah.
One of the challenges you've faced, not in just the making of the Chuck Berry film, but in general, the music business in the 1970s was not exactly welcoming to women. How did you find your way into the business?
Well, I think book publishing was different. There were many women in book publishing. And my partner was a woman, Jeannie Sakol. And what happened is I started off as an agent, and I was attracted to guys writing books on Bob Dylan and Elvis Presley were attracted to me. I was at a publishing house, and I was given these books to consider whether they should be published. And another person was Tom Robbins, because everybody else in the publishing house was 80 years old. This is in London. So a number of these writers said to me, you know, my old fart agent, he doesn't know who Bob Dylan is, Mick Jagger, anybody. You should be an agent. You understand. This is my history, you know, it's the music I grew up with. So I started representing some of these writers. And then when I got to America, realized that there was no publishing company that was publishing books about musicians, because the concept was that people who like music couldn't read. So we did put lots of pictures into the books. But because music is a visual thing anyway. And actually the film came about because we had this idea of putting together all the Beatles music and getting every writer, Rolling Stone writer, to write something about the Beatles. So we had this huge white elephant, this 2-volume, I don't know how many, 800 pages of this huge book, which goes for a lot of money now, and all the Beatles music. So. And then we said, and the publishing company, but we weren't doing it ourselves, Bantam was doing it. I said, how the hell do we publish this? And we said, well, you know, they had this thing called PI, per inquiry. They had this thing on syndicated television where you could advertise something and people could, you know, there's an 800 number, and, you know, this is in the old days, and you could purchase the item. So we thought, we'll make a little film about the Beatles, and we'll put it on television, and we'll sell the book. Well, it turned out two things. One, actually, you cannot sell the same product that you're advertising, which is, sounds weird, but it was a strange story. And then we started to make this film on the Beatles. Well, you can't just make a 15-minute film on the Beatles or a 5-minute film on the Beatles. So what happened is that we started doing research. I hired a researcher, actually, Patrick Montgomery, who had a very good editor, and he started interviewing all the people around the Beatles, music, including a very long interview with George Martin, who became the central figure in the film. And suddenly we had this masses of footage and really no money. We weren't a film company. So but simultaneously along came home video. And suddenly there was another, other than television, there was another means to exploit the film. So we went to various home video companies to try and raise the money, and they said, oh, Beatles, they'll sue, they'll sue. Well, they did sue, actually, but we settled with them a very small amount because they used us as a way of hitting up other people. But we eventually went to MGM, and we refused to insure it, and so they had no insurance, which is risky. But they took it on, and they sold millions of copies. So, they did well out of it. So after that, we had all these other books about rock stars, and then I was approached by somebody about doing a Everly Brothers reunion concert, and the Everly Brothers hadn't spoken for about 10 years. So that was what David was saying, is that it's not just about the film, it's the behind the film. It's like raising money, getting the people to talk on camera, and in the case of the Everly Brothers, getting the guys to actually agree to perform for the first time in, I think it was going to be 13 years, at the Royal Albert Hall. And so again, it was, I got a good introduction through Sam Trust. I met Phil Everly. We flew to Nashville and got together with Don, and the money was good. We raised the money, and they decided to do it. And we also simultaneously did a documentary with the BBC, which is very interesting because we went back to their hometown, went back to Kentucky. Their father was a coal miner. And so
just to stop for a second, what's vital about this is if these things don't happen because of a producer like Stephanie, then they're lost forever. The history of the Everly Brothers as an important force in the early days of rock and roll was well documented, but there was no way to celebrate it. There were some old black and white clips of them on television, but there was no way in the 1980s to experience the Everly Brothers. They had stopped touring. They had stopped, as Stephanie said, stopped talking to each other. So these weren't just music documentaries that were telling a story. They were actually creating history at the same time. And so the Everly Brothers almost becomes a template for what you did with Chuck Berry.
yeah, I mean, I think that it was, once you've done a couple of films, obviously then you have a reputation, and if you show the films to the manager normally, and then it comes down to money, of course. But it's a lot about really my feeling, except for maybe in the case of Joni Mitchell, where I was sort of thrust into something that wasn't my project, but I took it over. Most of the time, you'll meet with the artist, and then you also put together a team of people who, for example, on the Beach Boys, did the film with Alan Boyd, who, like David, had a deep knowledge of the Beach Boys. so that you need someone who can get into the nitty-gritty, that it's just not a superficial film, you know, of a few hits. It's like someone who the Beach Boys would trust to interview them. And they knew Alan, and he took care of their archive, a lot of their archive. So he knew them, and so he trusted them. And at the time, Brian was really just coming out of, you know, starting to be public again. So it was a delicacy in all of that. So it's about relationships. I mean, a camera is a camera. You can hire a crew, you know, if you've got money, you can hire a crew to shoot whatever you want to shoot. But it's what do you want to shoot? And I guess it's not just in music, it's in anything. You know, there's so many documentaries wonderful documentaries been made, but obviously the person making them and doing the interviewing has to get permission and the trust of the artist or the subject. And one of the things I did, which I thought was clever, was that I always said, you can have the last word. I would never put into a film something you don't like. So I, you know, immediately, of course, and even though Chuck had that right, he didn't exercise it. And sometimes they would fight you on things. But the fact was you were willing to make changes, and if you didn't want to make that change because it was integral to the film, then you fought for it. So again, it's about the relationship.
The key word is trust. You're asking somebody who has devoted their entire life to doing what they've done. You're going to them and saying, let me encapsulate that in 90 minutes or 2 hours. Why should I trust you? Well, as Stephanie said, well, let me show you what I did with the Everly Brothers, etc., the Beatles. So you see the kind of work we do. So yes, you can trust us. With Chuck Berry, you took on one of the most difficult human beings in the history of the entertainment business of any kind, because he hadn't trusted anybody in over 30 years.
I don't think I knew that. We had just done the Roy Orbison Black and White Night, and so we had this sort of concept of, we were doing this series for HBO, and we had this idea of getting a lot of musical talent who were influenced by the artists. In the case of Roy Orbison, almost every rock star of a certain generation, so almost everybody. In the same way, obviously, with Chuck. So it was actually originally going to be a film for HBO, but what happened is that I started to realize that, you know, Chuck is enormous. You know, he's the most important person. He is the godfather of rock and roll.
Well, it's like talking about the Catholic Church and Jesus.
Yeah,
there is no Catholic Church without Jesus. There's no rock and roll without Chuck Berry.
Simultaneously, my friend Susie Peterson, who I'd made films for at Universal Home Video, Susie was given a division that was going to do low-budget feature films. So she happened to call me and say, you know, if you have any ideas. And I said, well, what about a film on Chuck Berry? And she said, well, if you can get a feature film director attached to it, then it's possible. So in the book you can read, we interviewed 4 or 5 major directors, from Barry Levinson, Bob Rafelson, Milos Forman, I'm forgetting somebody, and of course Taylor Hackford. And it was interesting because Chuck came to all these meetings, and one of them was at the, you know, the director would choose where we were going to meet. So Bob Rafelson said, let's meet at the Dome, which was the Hollywood restaurant at the time, where everybody had, you know, famous for lunch, being seen. And so he invited us to have lunch with him at the Dome. And sure enough, Chuck arrives. We have a big table. The menu's on the table. And Chuck has got this brown paper bag. And Bob says, Chuck, you know, here's the menu, would you like something to drink? No, I have some OJ, he had some orange juice. And he said, you know, you can have anything from the menu. He said, no, I have my own lunch. And he took out a Big Mac at Le Dome and proceeded to eat his hamburger. And it's interesting because, you know, why did he do that? It was obviously somewhat embarrassing to everybody. We're sitting there going, this is Bob Rafelson, you know, you're insulting him, bringing a hamburger into the restaurant. And that Taylor Hackford was clever. Taylor had once met Chuck with his son at a Chinese restaurant in Hollywood, you know, pretty funky restaurant. And he suggested meeting at this Chinese restaurant. And first thing he said to Chuck was, you don't remember me, but I got your autograph for my son, Rio. And Chuck ordered Chinese food. He didn't bring his own food. And you could see that obviously, you know, this was the guy. And Taylor made it very clear what he wanted from Chuck, and Chuck said yes to everything, which doesn't mean in the end we got everything. But he was very, you know, he did the forward to the book, and he was very explicit. You know, I want to go to the prison, I want to do a scout there, I want to film there, I want you to talk about, you know, your criminal background, you know, a documentary that is true to your life story. But essentially what happened is that Chuck, I think, thought he was just going to do a performance and get a bag of money, and that would be it. And so,
because that's what he'd been doing for 30 years.
Yeah, he'd been doing that, and then getting a backup band, you know, picking a backup band wherever he was playing.
This film was in many ways a resurrection project, because Chuck Berry's reputation as a live performer had been going downhill dramatically in the 20 years prior to this, because he didn't, I don't know if there's anybody else like him. He would show up in town, the promoter would provide him with musicians who were, sometimes they might be professional, like Bruce Springsteen actually backed up Chuck Berry at one point. But more often than not, they were not necessarily great bands. They just could play Chuck Berry songs. And he didn't care. He was there to be Chuck Berry on stage for 30 or 45 minutes, play his hits, leave with a pile of cash. And so rather than playing venues like Madison Square Garden, where an artist of his stature should have been, he was playing some pretty you know, off the beaten path kind of places. So Chuck Berry almost was a phantom figure before this movie. You would see him maybe at a festival or something like that, but Chuck Berry's still alive. He's around.
Yeah.
Making a movie about him, and it was like, what's going on?
Yeah, no, it's true. It was. I think that that's what he was doing. He was getting probably 25 grand to do 45 minutes. He would fly to the venue or drive to the venue, and then fly or drive back to his house, or go on to the next venue. But it was all about the money, which we came to realize once we started filming, or before we started filming, actually. But I think that Chuck is a very private person, and when you realize there is in the film, if you remember, there's a scene where Taylor follows him to a gig in a state fair where he picks up a band, and he picks up a Cadillac at the, puts his guitar on the, you know, just checks it, right? Picks up a Cadillac at the airport, drives to the venue, does the gig, well, gets the money, does the gig, walks off, never does an encore, gets back in the car, goes to the airport, and flies home. So he did this in the middle of our filming. I mean, you know, and lost his voice as a result of it because he got a cold. But that was his life. That's what it was, pick up a band, get the bag of money and go. So when Keith Richards wanted to have Chuck, get some great music, original, the way Chuck used to play, which is also a bit of a mistake because Chuck hadn't, was a lot older since he first recorded Maybelline. Chuck really, he wanted, there were fights over, he wanted his band, who were a bunch of guys, local guys in Wentzville, who played in a bar. So he used to play there sometimes. In fact, I think it was his bar. So Keith was like, no, if I'm doing this film, I'm picking my musicians. And he was really quite disrespectful to them initially. In fact, he really didn't care about anybody. That was what was extraordinary. It was kind of like he as Keith said, we kind of invaded, we shot the rehearsals at his house. So we kind of, basically we jumped into his life, in his living room, his kitchen, his club room. And, he was a guy who was intensely private. In fact, he would disappear. He was like this very, where's Chuck? Nobody would know. He had this house that he built himself, I think. But it wasn't like a Beverly Hills mansion, that's for sure. And I think he was just, he would get into it a little bit, and then the famous scene where he's correcting, when they're practicing "Oh Carol," you know that he's playing with Keith, and he's showing who is the boss, So.
I mean, there's a certain irony, of course, because if somebody had gone to Keith Richards in that era and said, I want to make a movie about you and the Rolling Stones and invade your life that way, it wouldn't have happened in a million years. Keith, who, whatever condition he was in at the time, this was his chance to repay the man who had basically created the Rolling Stones. There is no Rolling Stones without people like Chuck Berry.
Or Beatles, yeah.
Or Beatles, or the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys, it was said they combined Chuck Berry with 4 freshman vocals, and that's how they became a group. So Chuck Berry is the Rosetta Stone here, and he didn't really care whether anybody was paying homage to him. He just, it was, and one of the things that's fascinating in reading Johnny B. Bad, which is, of course, is a pun on his legendary Johnny B. Good, is it seems like almost, at least every week, if not every day, he had his hand out for another pile of cash for another reason, so in a sense, you became kind of the stand-in for the music industry who had screwed him his entire career, and he was exacting his revenge on you and Keith. And there's some pretty hairy moments in this film. I don't know how candid you can be about what happened in the prison, but it was terrifying. What you went through as a producer to make this happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I had called Susie Peterson at Universal at one point, or I spoke to Universal lawyers, because every day Chuck would ask for more money. And also he was harassing me, saying to me that, well, if you came across, then maybe I could make a deal, we could make a deal, like pay less money or something. So I called Universal and I told them what was going on. And essentially, Susie Peterson said they agreed to pay the money. They said, well, sexual harassment really wasn't talked about in those days. It certainly happened a lot. But Susie Peterson, we were by that time, Taylor had millions of dollars worth of equipment in Wentzville. We had a crew of 50. We were kind of, he had us in a rock and a hard place, Chuck. He knew it. He knew the crew was there, Taylor was there, the musicians were coming. So he knew that he could essentially blackmail us, and that's what he did. And Universal, they kind of were like, the show has to go on. So even though, and in the end, they did sort of figure out a way of let him write what he wants, as opposed to you negotiating every day, so that then maybe afterwards we can, we can sue him for duress or something. But, we were locked into, the musicians, the stars, crew, everything. And yet on the first day, Chuck, we're going to film at the Cosmo Club, which was the first place he ever performed with Johnny Johnson trio. He actually stole the trio from out of Johnny, but that's another story. But anyway, Taylor got his production people to make this habitable so we could do a concert there. And there had been a big storm. It was in East St. Louis. It was a dangerous part of town. And he said he'd be there at 7 in the morning. We're all waiting, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, nothing. And about 10 or 11 o'clock, we noticed that, or Taylor notices that there's a phone box, and this phone is ringing all the time. Now, this is, like a regular phone box on the street. Nobody thought, we didn't have cell phones in those days, remember? So eventually, Taylor says, will somebody pick that phone up? And it was Chuck. And he said, can I speak to Taylor? And so Taylor picks up the phone and says, Chuck, where are you? I've been here for 4 hours. I've got a crew here. What's going on? And he said, Taylor, there's nothing, you and I, we're great. Nothing, no problem with you. We're buddies. I need to talk to the producer. So he kind of, he didn't want Taylor to feel there was any hard, nothing to do with him. So of course what happened is that then Albert Spivak, who was a business affairs person, and I went out to Berry Park. So we lost a whole day of filming practically. And we had to agree, even though we had a contract, he said it's not in the contract. Now what do you do when you're, as I said, with a crew, with the stars, with Keith rehearsing them? What do you do? Either you give in, essentially.
So he wanted 10 or 20 or 30
20,
more?
I think it was like 25 seemed to be the number for everything. And then on the final day, of course, on the final day, he was contractually only supposed to do one show, but Taylor, the director, thought, and it was being shot on film, remember? So we had like 6,000 people outside, so it was a long time before we started. Then you have to change, canisters all the time, and there was downtime with other problems, sound problems. And so, but before this, Chuck says, I'm not going on. So that took some time. Why? Because I'm only agreed to do one show, and you're filming 2 shows. So I'm not going. He was all dressed up and everything. And I think the band, I don't know if the band was on stage. Anyway, there was 6,000 people outside, and then there was going to be a second show after that. So we finished at like 5 in the morning. And his agent was there. Taylor was on his hands and knees, We're all saying, look, Chuck, you've got 6,000 people out there. It's Saturday. How, no one is at Universal. How are we going to get $25,000, when the banks are closed? And cash, he wanted cash. So what we did was we took all the money from the safe for the tickets and the popcorn people, and all the
concessions.
And put it in a paper bag. And I have to say, I was so mad. I walked Taylor wanted to wire me, but I was...
For sound.
For sound. I was to see what the conversation would be between Chuck and I, but I was nervous that you know, we might get nothing at all if Chuck found out that I was, you know, he was being taped. So I didn't, but I walked in and I had this, you know, it was a lot of, it was literally cash, you know, so it's a very heavy bag. And I threw this bag at his head. And for a minute, kind of I didn't aim it at his head, I just aimed it at him, but he was sitting down, I was standing. And for a minute, you know, he kind of blinked and I thought, oh, maybe I've killed him or something. That'd be a good ending for the story. But so, and then it goes on and on. Beyond the filming, he was arrested at Universal for trying to film the screening of the film that was being screened for Susie Peterson and myself and Chuck. And so he was taken away by security, and I had to call the head of the studio and say, I don't think you want, you know,
The story
a star, yeah, to be in the newspapers. And then we had the publicity tour. So with a film like this, I'm sure with most feature films, the end isn't once you got it in the can. We had to do a tremendous amount of looping because he lost his voice. And he was brilliant at doing that. Brilliant. So, you know, it's just filming something is the beginning. That's, you know, making the deal that's nothing. You made a deal, and things will go wrong. And who is responsible? Well, you know, it's like the buck stops here, basically. Because I've signed a contract to deliver a film, as you did, David. You know, no matter how tormented you are, it is the kind of the show has to go on. There's no time for the producer to have a meltdown because what's going to happen?
What in your background, what experiences can you point to that gave you the kind of steely strength to deal with this daily assault?
Honestly, I have to say, it was a horrible experience. I mean, it was great in a way that, you know, Keith and Taylor and I mean, we went to Jamaica. When we were alone and could talk about it, and, you know, it was like a war. We were all at war with Chuck. So everybody was, you know, so we were a team. So there was a lot of camaraderie with the crew. Everybody knew what was going on. And so, you know, there was a lot of sympathy. But it was terrifying because we really didn't know if he was going to show up. We didn't know how Universal was going to react. I don't think that, certainly there have been instances where we'd had problems with artists, but I don't think anyone had ever behaved like that. I didn't have any idea. I mean, if I had any idea, I wouldn't have done the film. Let's put it that way, you know, for my sanity. But once you've signed that deal, and
if you want to start lining up with questions, what inspired you to write the book?
well, I was, Jeff Kempin at Eagle Rock in England told me a story about how
Eagle Rock, home video.
home video. They've distributed a lot of our films. They were really the biggest distributor of music films. Anyway, he was very good friends with Frank Zappa's wife, Pamela. I think her name was Pamela. And he and I would get together and talk, you know, business stories like, can you believe this happened? Can you believe that happened? You know, because we could share them because we're in the business. And he kept saying to me, you know, and anyway, Pamela Zappa died. And he kept saying to her, write a book, you know, this is history, this is history. And so when I went to see him in London, he said to me, you have to write a book because this is, you know, she died before she could do it. And there were so many fantastic stories. And it is part of our history. So I said, okay. And so the only way I started writing it, and it was, you know, so much to remember that Tom Edelman, who was my production manager on and helped me with this book, suggested that why don't you record, you know, I'll interview you. And also, Tom knew a lot of, because he was the production manager, he took care of a lot of the nuts and bolts on films that I didn't take care of. So we both had different roles. And so he said, why don't I interview you? And he'd worked for me for something like 12 years at Delilah. So he was there for most of the films, not for Delilah, not for the Beatles. I'm in the middle of doing this. We're doing this book, and I think we had sort of gotten to Chuck Berry, or we kind of left Chuck Berry for the end, I think. And Chuck died. And everybody a lot of people involved with the film, Taylor, Steve Jordan, I mean, everybody started calling each other and saying, do you remember, do you remember, do you remember? Oh my God, you know, remember that. And so I said, gee, you know, maybe there's a book just in the Chuck Berry film.
It's like if you all got together for dinner and traded Chuck Berry stories. It's really it's fascinating. It's an insight into kind of the depths of the pain that Chuck Berry had to have experienced before going to jail, for him to kind of the way he regarded the world with a complete lack of trust in the last half of his life, because he didn't care about anything or anybody based on this, whereas there may be other stars who might have felt that same way, but they would have pretended. There's no pretense in his behavior.
Yeah, there's a chapter in here about Taylor did an interview with Bo Diddley and Little Richard and Chuck, and it's very revealing because Chuck doesn't say very much. He just sort of agrees and says, you know, Little Richard says, you know, we was black and they was white and we weren't allowed to play to them and they didn't like us, you know. And then Pat Boone recorded, what was the song he did? Pat Boone covered. And those white men covered our songs. And Chuck really didn't really join in, but the interview is in the, Taylor allowed me to take it from the DVD, which is going to come out again soon. And also Chuck did he interviewed Robbie Robertson. Robbie Robertson interviewed Chuck, sorry, and at Chuck's house, and with Chuck's scrapbook. And unfortunately, the publisher couldn't figure out how to put all the pictures in. There was his first driver's license, but it's quite revealing. What I wanted to do was to tell you something about Chuck. A lot of you probably don't know his history, so that the audience would know something about his life. And before I started talking about the film, although these are segments in the film. And then there's a Bruce Springsteen story about when he backed up Chuck Berry. So there's stuff that's actually on the DVD, which is wonderful to read, as well as what happened during the making of the film, the post-production, and the publicity tour, which we went all over the world with that. So there were the trips we made to Chicago, where Keith played with Chuck at one point. We went to Jamaica and stayed at Keith's house. I mean, it was kind of a 2-year, I don't think I've ever had a film take so long to make. It's like a lifetime.
Well, reading the book, I had a virtual stomach ache the entire time because I could feel, literally, the cliche, I could feel your pain, because you would wake up every morning and wonder what horrible thing is going to happen this day. Let's get to some student questions. Please say your name.
Hi, my name is Robbie. Thank you for coming in to talk with us. Actually, my question is about, your time in the UK possibly, because I did spend a couple of years there as well. I was wondering, because after studying some television, I learned that like writers in the UK for television have more of a say in terms of creative freedom over the producers. So I guess I was wondering if you had any insights on working on projects here versus in the UK, if you did do much work back there.
I didn't do. I worked for London Weekend Television, and I also worked as a journalist in England. I knew a lot of the people in the journalistic world, and I did actually at London Weekend. Every year they nominated somebody to work under a director. But this you're talking about the 60s, and what happened is that women were not allowed. I was not allowed into the union before Rupert Murdoch broke the union, the journalists' union in England. I couldn't join because they only allowed one woman a year or something. And London Weekend Television, the idea of a woman being given that job was, I used to work on these things in that role, but I wanted to get the title of that. So I worked in television before, and I worked on a film in Australia, and I worked in the theatre. So I had a good idea of how difficult everybody could be, whether it was the person only in the theatre. So I knew how difficult stars could be, because I had worked on a program, I've forgotten the name of it, but it was an arts program London Weekend Television did, of singers and writers, etc. So was it any different? I don't think. I think the times are different now, but I don't think the country would have made it. I couldn't wait to get out of England, to tell you the truth. I thought it was much more sexist than America.
To the question of writers having control of their material, certainly the theater is the place where writers have the most control. They're called the author of the play, and according to the playwrights, the union that the playwrights are in, you're not allowed to change a word of it without the playwright's permission. I guess Shakespeare doesn't get to say very much these days about how you change his dialogue, but if you're a living playwright, you're the author of it. In terms of television, there are now so many outlets and so many places that are seeking the best, and there's so many programs that are niche, that if you're the creator and writer and the creative voice of a program, you have much more control than you did in terms of the days when there were just a few networks. And that's why networks like HBO became so attractive to creators, because there was much more freedom for the writers. But I guess the way I would look at it is, if you want complete creative control, write a poem. Nobody's going to edit that.
Also, I think that, you see this list of executive producers and producers on a film, and you can bet that a lot of those have had input into a script. So I think that, I think probably the theater or a poem is maybe the only place, or if you have a concept, I don't know, I tried to sell some shows to NBC, and everyone that I brought up, they said, we have something like that in it. You sign a thing that says that if we have something similar, then you acknowledge that, we didn't steal your idea. It was a piece of paper. It was something you had to sign before you walked into the office. And it was amazing how they always had something exactly the same.
I guess the best way to look at it is, it's not about the idea, it's about the execution of the idea. So if you walk in with a finished script that tells the story the way you want to tell it, then you hold at least the initial card before they buy it, if they want it, that it's like, you can say, this is the way I want it to be. And then depending upon how much money you need to make it, you start to compromise.
The other thing about writing, actually, that with the exception, I didn't direct this film, but what I found as a director is, and when I work with directors, I've insisted on this, is that you get hours and hours with documentaries of transcripts, right? And so how do you, to go into the editing room and trying to start edit that is, you just could take years. So always I insisted, and I did it myself, to put together a rough script from the transcripts, which of course, with computers is pretty easy to, you have it in there and you do a rough cut and then you hone it down from that, rather than trying to, which I had happen with one director who ultimately we got rid of, because she couldn't, it was just a mess, and there was no continuity, there was no, a documentary has to have a beginning, middle, and end, just like any feature film, there has to be a sort of denouement somewhere. So you're still writing. A documentary is, I would always advise, whatever the subject is, if you've got, you're interviewing people, and transcribe it and look at it, and it's so much easier to play with it then, and to cut it, and cut out stuff that's repetitive and whatever.
Yeah, in terms of, we would call it a paper cut, is you've got all these interviews, you might do 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 interviews for a documentary, and you're looking for the sound bites, the 2 or 3 sentences or 1 sentence from your interview subjects, and then sequencing it in such a way that the story emerges. And what we saw in the first half of class, when we saw what was essentially a visual paper cut of the second act of the drum machine documentary, what you're doing is making sure the story makes sense before you put footage over the sound bites. And so in a sense, it's funny to think of writing a documentary. But it's a story. And who are the people who are going to tell the story? Well, the people who you're interviewing. And so sequencing those sound bites is the writing of the script. A question?
Hi, my name is Emily. Thank you so much for being here. You mentioned the discrimination that you face being a woman in the industry, and that obviously takes a lot of strength to overcome. So I was just wondering how you went about persevering with that, and did you ever feel that you had to prove yourself even more because of being a woman, and do you still?
I think definitely the music business is a male-dominated world, even though most of the women were in publicity department. There weren't really many A&R women, artist representatives. They were all men. So you are dealing with, business affairs person might be a woman, but most of the time managers, all men, or they might have had women, I've forgotten what's her name, she went on to run, she took over Yetnikov's position. But
That's Sylvia Rowe.
no, but she was, she was one. So, you could handful. So you were dealing with managers who were, I haven't seen the Elton John film, but I knew of John Reed before, I understand he's not portrayed in a very good light. But these managers were, I remember Tom and I at the Sunset Marquee, we used to stay there, and we were sitting by the pool, and there was a woman there with a little girl who went on to be Lily Collins. And it was Phil Collins' wife. And so we got talking. There were little pools around the place. So we were in this sort of small pool with a little girl who's gone on to become a big actress. And so we said, we were doing this something, I can't remember what it was at the time. It'd be great to have Phil involved. So she said, call the manager, Simon Napier. So I called him, and it was like, I mean, he was so unbelievably belligerent. How dare you speak to, and I think maybe Phil came out as well. Maybe at the end he came out, and his wife said, oh, Stephanie is telling me about this project. And he said, oh yeah, give Simon a call, it sounds great. My head was blown off, and he never did. I can't remember what the project, might have been Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, but anyway, it was out of the question, you know. I mean, so it definitely is a sexist world. As I said, publishing I didn't think was so much so. I don't know, I'm not in that world today, although I think the company I'm with, there's 2 men and the rest are women. It's hard being a woman. It's harder, no doubt about it.
I can tell you, no, I didn't know Stephanie in her London days, but when I met her in 1977, there was no, she was a person in a position, to me, a person of power. There was a hierarchy. Writers needed agents, writers needed publishers, writers needed book packagers. So I was looking up to her as somebody who could get me where I wanted to go. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, but the origin story of the book, the first book we did together, I had been hired to do photo research for a book that was not a sequel, but it was the second in a series of books. Your first book was Growing Up with the Beatles, and it was written from the point of view of a Beatles fan. And the second book was going to be called Sand Tracks, Growing Up with the Beach Boys, and it was going to be written from the point of view of somebody growing up in Southern California during the 1960s with the Beach Boys, and the Beach Boys music is kind of the soundtrack of his times. And it was with Ron Koslow, yes? He was a screenwriter. And so we all met, and I was hired to do the photo research, and then Ron dropped off the project. He sold a mini-series, which from an economic point of view of a writer, I don't know what his advance was going to be for the book, but trust me, the fee for writing a mini-series for a network television was 5, 10, 15, or 20 times what the book fee was going to be. And so suddenly I saw my job disappearing doing this research, and I wrote an impassioned letter to Stephanie suggesting that we change the focus of the book, that rather than it being called Sand Tracks, Growing Up in the 1960s in California, that it be called The Beach Boys and the California Myth, about somebody who grew up in the East and came to California because of the Beach Boys music. And when I turned in the first draft of the book, there was absolutely nothing about that in the book. And Stephanie called me and says, where's the part about California and you? And I had never had any intention of writing that. I wanted to write a biography of Brian Wilson. So I said, oh, okay, I'll write that. And so if you were to pick up the book today, there's a foreword to the book that's about, I don't know, 8 or 16 pages, is about me growing up back east and thinking of California. But essentially it was a biography of Brian Wilson. So I was just being a little bit Chuck Berry on that project. But Stephanie, you know, whatever indignities she had suffered prior to my meeting her, whatever pain she suffered after that in terms of dealing with the music business, which was really, I mean, a lot of, you know, in those days they called them male chauvinist pigs. You would just say they were pigs. Our relationship was a very straightforward one. Stephanie had a project, and I could do it. And we did 2.5 books together. The third one ended up not happening. It was a book on Kiss, because Kiss's manager changed his mind at the last minute because it was going to jeopardize one of their projects. So it's a very strange business, and there's so much money, or there was so much money in the music business, that managers kept people like Stephanie and I away from their clients to protect that relationship. They didn't want anybody to get in between them and their artists, because their livelihood depended upon it, their mortgage payments depended on it. And so getting past that was a challenge. It was given the ambition of what Stephanie was doing, it was an enormous challenge for her as a woman. Do you think being British helped at all?
Well, I remember with Hail Hail Rock and Roll, we all stayed in a hotel with the artists, and so we all had breakfast together, basically. And Tom and I were sitting having breakfast, and Eric Clapton sat down next to us, and he was funny. He said, actually, what I really like doing is fishing. I don't like all this music stuff. But later that day, his manager then was Roger Forrester, came up to me, and well, actually, the first thing that happened was that maybe, I don't think I said this in the book, or maybe I did, but the first thing that happened was, on the first day, his, I don't know what you'd call him, his assistant or some, you know, guitar guy or whatever, anyway, the guy comes up to me and says to me, Eric needs 6 grams of cocaine. I said, what? So I need to get 6 grams of cocaine. We were in the middle of Wentzville, Missouri, can you imagine? I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not a drug dealer, and it's not my job as a producer. Well, I'm telling you, Eric won't perform if he doesn't get it. Somehow, I guess he did, I don't know. They were doing, he and Keith were doing cocaine. But I was not the one. But that was before anything started, I think. That was like first thing. And then Roger Forrester says to me, how dare you sit with Eric Clapton? I said, what are you talking about? I didn't say anything to Tom. I said, he sat down next to us. We were sitting there, and he came and joined us. Don't you ever, ever do that again. I mean, you know, you can't make this stuff up, you know.
Hi, my name is Jenna. I just want to say I appreciate how candid you were being about your experience with Chuck. And you mentioned how difficult it was and that you might not have done the film had you known how difficult it was going to be working with him. I just want to know if that changed how you approached other things you worked on, other projects, if it affected ones you selected or...
I think that what we said was nothing could ever be this hard again, and that we could do anything in the world after that. I mean, Taylor Hackwood said that no feature film he'd ever worked on was more difficult. So I think that actually, ultimately, we felt, oh my God, we've come out of the war. Maybe
we survived D-Day.
We survived D-Day. I just saw that Peter Jackson film last night. Have you seen it?
No.
About documentary. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that, you know, as I said, once you sign that piece of paper, I mean, I guess I could have walked away in the middle of it. But once you've, you know, it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? We all know about that one. So it seemed like a good idea. Chuck agreed to do it. We had a contract. Who knew? You know, so I think that sometimes you do get involved with projects, sometimes very complicated. I had another situation with a not very good experience with a woman, actually, executive. So, you know, you just have to, I think that Jeannie Seiko used to say it's like the yay, boo business. So, yay, it's a good day, boo, it's a bad day. You know, and you just have to be passionate about it and sort of meditate or so, I don't know. But, you know, I mean, I had children as well, so I had, in the early days, I didn't see much of them, I have to say, early on. But in a way, it was something nice to come home to.
Good question. The cliche is that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So having survived the worst, was there any project that was as close to? Was there anyone that was also nightmarish in the?
I wouldn't say with an artist. I would say that it was with an executive, of course, Susan Lacey at PBS. I'd done a lot of interviewing and recut a lot of the films. So Joni Mitchell, for 2 years, Eagle, this company made a deal to make a documentary on her. And this guy from England was going to direct it. And he kept coming over and meeting with Joni and giving all these big ideas about driving around LA in a car. And so that she sort of backed off. And then one day, this guy called me. Finally, Joni said, okay, you can do an interview, blah, blah, blah. So, so I was to produce the film. So I called the director and I said, we're on for this day. He said, oh, it's my son's birthday. I said, well, you know, I can't possibly be there. You have to change it. I said, well, that's not up to me. That's up to the company that owns the project. You know, it wasn't my project. I was being hired. So I said, it's not up to me. So I went back to the manager and said, well, you know, is there any way of pushing it like a day or something? Remember, he lived in England. This was LA. And he said, I wouldn't try and do that. So I called the head of the company who had commissioned the film and said, what do you want to do? And he said, well, I said, honestly, I don't know that much about Joni Mitchell. I mean, this guy who was going to do the film was like had spent 2 years researching every song. And, you know, her music's very, very complicated. And I said, well, I don't know. And so he said, well, look, if maybe like you get your foot in the door, you know, it'll get the project moving. And so that's what and actually, on the very day, my phone is ringing. She lived in Beverly Hills somewhere. And my phone is ringing, and I know they're trying to cancel the shoot, right? So meantime, the camera crew is on their way, and I just ignored the phone call. And we get there, and she's like, what are you doing here? I said, well, your manager, so she called her manager, and she said, there's a camera crew here. And this woman, she didn't know me and what do I do? So he like rushed over from one of the hotels, and he said, you know, didn't you get my message? Oh, in the meantime, I had to submit to him. I stayed up for 2 days teaching myself about Joni Mitchell, listening to Joni Mitchell, reading about her. And the director sent me a list of questions that were about half a page long. And so I tried to sort of, you know, cut them down, and so they'd be sort of one sentence.
Each question was half a page.
Yeah, the question was, and they were incredibly complex about the music. I mean, about this, you know, this line in this song, this riff, this what. And so I said, oh my God. So I sent it to the manager, and he said, no, you've got 12 questions, and none of these are acceptable. So I said, oh. So I had to write, based on this guy's, you know, stuff he'd sent over, and I called him, and I said, look, 12 questions. And they have to go back to the guy as well. And he said, that's impossible. I said, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to ask, you've got 12 questions or what? So finally we came up with, and we sent them off to the manager, and then he crossed through about, maybe with more than 12, but anyway, they'd say there were 20. He crossed through like half of them. And the funny thing is, on the day, so we would turn up, we're not supposed to be there, right? So they haven't managed to cancel us. And Joni just rambled. First she had to go and have lunch. So we went to the Daily Grill and had lunch. And she, interesting enough, she talked about Bob Dylan, about Leonard Cohen. She talked about loads of things. You know, you wanted to have a camera rolling. You know, it's like, we should be filming this, right? And the strange thing was that, so I thought, oh, well, I'll have to make a note of that and ask her about that when she's doing the interview. When I asked her in the interview, she completely contradicted what she had said. It was really interesting how she wasn't influenced by Dylan. She thought Leonard was a boudoir poet or something. But anyway, it's a bit of a long story. But anyway, so I went to Saskatoon. One of my wonderful moments of my life was walking down the main street in Saskatoon with Joni Mitchell, arm in arm with her, saying, here we are, two grandmothers walking down the main street of Saskatoon, which is in Canada and is basically a one-horse town. She was having an art show there. And, anyway, that was a moment. But ultimately what happened is that it's all about money. And PBS was supposed to put up money to complete the film.
This is a series called American Masters,
American
and
Masters.
Susan Lacey was the executive producer of the series.
So, but the first we had to do a version for Canada because they had, like, I don't know, for Canada Day or something or another. So we did that, and then, which was not to be the version for, and I interviewed David Geffen, David Crosby, I mean, you know, loads and loads of people. And the other director kind of fell by the wayside, basically. So one day, Susan caused this, which she had done to several other, the person who did Paul Simon film was actually in South Africa. It was his whole concept. She, like, fired him the day that, you know, and actually think he had like a nervous breakdown or something. I can understand that. Anyway, so she basically said, well, you know, I want to take over this film, and so, you know, get rid of Stephanie. So, you know, there was really nothing, so it was $500,000. It meant $500,000 to them. So what do you think they did? But anyway, I sued to keep my name on it because I directed a lot of the stuff. So it's not always the men, but.
We have time for one more question.
Not to be sexist about men, for God's sake. There are some wonderful men in the world, like my husband, like David.
We were neighbors, actually, for a while. Yes.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I was wondering if, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, you might look back and give yourself or your team any advice in dealing with a difficult artist like Chuck Berry, and what advice you might give someone in 2019 who's dealing with a difficult artist?
I guess patience, you know, I think it depends who the artist is. I mean, I think that, you know, sometimes there can be with Roy Orbison, you know, he was, my husband, I managed him. We took Roy Orbison, everyone thought he was blind and dead, and we resurrected him. As you know, I think it's one of the best films I've ever done, and one of the best music films. And we managed to do the first black and white film. And so sometimes you know, it's kind of I mean, being a producer, really, you have to take all the slings and arrows. You know, unfortunately, you're the one. The buck does stop here, and you know, and then people will complain to you, or like on Black and White Night, T-Bone Burnett did not want Bonnie Raitt to be in it, and I had worked with Bonnie on something else, and I knew her, and so I fought for that, and Bonnie was forever grateful. And then we did the Neville Brothers show in New Orleans, which she said was the first time that anyone ever bought her a first-class plane ticket and put her in a nice hotel. It's hard to believe that, isn't it, today? So I think that, you know, it's just, sometimes you just have to let people have their say and try and compromise or wait, and maybe the next day will be better or something. I mean, I recently had an experience I got involved in a project with two women, and I was kind of reluctant. They hadn't made a film before. I was sort of reluctant because it wasn't my project, but I said, I'll help you. I helped them in terms of the interviews, what kind of questions to ask and stuff. I couldn't do it myself because I was away. And they ended up disagreeing on how it should proceed at a certain point. I was sort of, they would call me and tell me, or one in particular would. And it was kind of like, in the end, I said, they were like, one of them said, what should I do if I don't agree with her and she won't listen to me? And I said, well, at a certain point, you just have to say it's not going to work out, and I don't think anything ever happened with it, but there should normally be a way of compromising. I guess that's the word, compromise.
It's an industry of a group of people come together to create something. And anytime there's a group of people, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be disagreements, creative or otherwise. And so it's the producer who's the one who has to kind of thread the needle and solve the problems on a minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis so that there is a film at the end. Because otherwise, a lot of projects would fall apart.
Yeah, and I mean, like the kind of concerts we did were very complex because you had not much rehearsal time when you got Bruce Springsteen and Jackson Browne. All these people have their own lives, and and then you've got T-Bone Burnett. We know he's a renowned musical director. Well, we actually asked, I guess Barbara and I agreed on him, but. In the night, after the rehearsal, the dress rehearsal, he decided at 3 in the morning to change the whole set, to move it around. And there were only like 2 people left to do it. But, who was going to argue with him? It's like it's a guy who's going to be responsible for making it sound good and the artists sound good. And I don't know whether you know the story, but there was an earthquake, the Whittier earthquake happened. We finished about 3 o'clock, and at 5 o'clock, the Whittier earthquake, and all our footage was covered in glass, and the whole set fell down. So if it had happened 5 hours earlier, it could have been actually pretty disastrous, but it's another story.
I didn't know that. Well, you need to write another book.
It's in my one that I started doing.
Well, anyway, we are not only out of time, but over time. Thank you to Stephanie Bennett for being here.